Ambassador Bolton, greetings and great to see you in First Western, and thank you for being with us again.
Glad to do it.
I would like to start with the results of NATO summit in Vilnius. In your opinion, why do NATO members hesitate to officially invite Ukraine to join NATO after the end of the war? Do they really fear Russian escalation, or do they plan to negotiate Ukraine's membership in NATO with Russia?
Well, I certainly don't think the issue was handled correctly. It's been longstanding NATO policy not to admit members that are in a state of war with somebody. It's no fault of the applicant, obviously, particularly in this case, but the concern is that doing that would trigger Article 5 of the NATO agreement, and we would all be in a state of war with Russia. I think the way to have handled this was to have had negotiations months and months ago to decide what the right formulation would be. But it seems to me that this is just NATO and the United States in particular, once again being deterred by the Kremlin in the conduct of the war and the conduct of our politics. This fear that Russia will escalate if we do something that offends them, as if the main problem here isn't the Russian invasion to begin with. And it's not at all clear what Moscow would escalate with, given the poor performance of its military. But it's a problem that has bedeviled us ever since the Russians invaded, and I think that's what explains the outcome. I don't think there's any doubt that that Ukraine should have been made a member of NATO through an agreement in 2008 at the Bucharest summit. That didn't happen because of French and German objections. In fact, if we had admitted Ukraine shortly thereafter, I don't think this invasion ever would have taken place, going back to 2014.
But do you think that if Ukraine is invited to join NATO after the end of the war, would Russia really escalate?
No, that might have been the way to handle it if people had thought about this. But I think by the time we got to the meeting in Vilnius, to many people, that sounded too much like just a flat-out invitation to join. So I say it's like the American movie Groundhog Day, going over the same thing again and again and again. It was the mistake made at the Bucharest summit, I think, unfortunately, signaled to Russia that it could act with impunity against both Ukraine and Georgia, which, of course, Russia did 4 months after Bucharest. So I think we should all be clear that Russia should not misread what happened here. My own view, as I say, is we should have handled this quietly before getting into an apparent confrontation, disagreement among NATO leaders and President Zelensky. You don't want to show division or weakness to the Russians at a time like this. And I'm afraid, unfortunately, that's the way it came out.
In your opinion, how should the wording of the next Washington NATO summit look like regarding the Ukraine's membership in NATO?
Well, next year, the summit will celebrate NATO's 75th anniversary, so I'm hoping this war will be finished then. I think Ukraine and NATO have suffered from not having the right strategy, NATO members not providing adequate resources. But I think there should be a way, and we've got a year to think about it, to make it clear that indeed Ukraine is going to join NATO, which is nothing more than what the alliance said in April of 2008. The mistake was letting all that time go by with all the unfortunate events since then.
Do you believe that the war in Ukraine will end before the next NATO summit in Washington?
Well, I certainly hope so. The spring offensive is going more slowly than people think, and perhaps expectations were raised too high. But the central problem is that although all NATO members say that the objective we seek is the restoration of full sovereignty and territorial integrity, by this repetitious behavior being intimidated by Moscow, we're not making the progress toward that goal that we should. So we've got a year to figure out how to do this. And I hope that people will not be deterred by this false notion that somehow the Russians have the capability to escalate. Do they have a hidden army somewhere? If they do, why aren't they using it in Ukraine where their troops are performing so poorly? People need to get a grip here. And if they are determined to repel the aggression, which they all say they are, then let's figure out how to do that in the most effective way.
You mentioned about Ukraine's counteroffensive operation. Wall Street Journal reports that Ukraine's counteroffensive could fail because Ukraine did not receive enough weapons from the West. What do you think about this article, and are there any people in the West or in the White House who could be afraid of Ukraine's military victory?
Look, I think that if you could start all this over again, you would say that we needed a strategy to achieve the objectives we all say we share. And strategy conceptually is not that hard. You decide what your objectives are, and then you pull together the resources necessary to accomplish the objectives. And that is something that NATO has not done. We have one argument after another about this weapon system or that weapon system or the next weapon system. Instead, we should have said at the beginning, what is it going to take to remove the Russian troops from Ukrainian soil? Okay, let's gather it all together and then let's go do it. So what I think Ukraine may be suffering from here is they ultimately get an adequate amount of javelins. They ultimately get HIMARS. They ultimately get Abrams tanks. They ultimately get F-16s somewhere off in the next couple of months. But that's not a strategy of how to win the war. The strategy is the U.S. would not fight that way. We'd say, all right, what do we need? Let's make sure we take the time to get it all together, and then let's do what we think is necessary. I think the White House, specifically President Biden and his advisors, have been deterred by Russia and these threats of escalation. I think the threats on the part of the Kremlin have been bluffs, whether on the conventional side or on the nuclear side. And when you succumb to a bluff, you're giving your adversary what they want for free. And I think we've done that over and over again. I hope we haven't made so many mistakes that the spring offensive fails as a result. I think the resources are adequate for the job as of now. I just hope that that's right.
So you believe that White House official and President Biden are just being bluffed by Russian side by their provocation and threats?
Yes, absolutely. If you listen to the rhetoric, and it's not just in the U.S., unfortunately, it's in many European countries too, they keep saying, well, we don't want World War III. I think the Russian performance, the combat arms performance on the ground in Ukraine shows Russia's not ready for World War III. Even on the nuclear side, apart from the recent deployment of tactical weapons to Belarus, every time Putin has rattled the nuclear saber, we've seen no indication of the deployment or redeployment of Russian nuclear capabilities. And the fact that there may be tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus today doesn't make any difference. The Russians have had any number of nuclear weapons in the Kaliningrad exclave for decades. And so putting some in Belarus doesn't change the military balance of power at all. It's a political signal, but there's no real indication, has not been for almost 17 months, that the nuclear threat, let alone the conventional threat by Russia to escalate, is anything other than Putin's imagination.
Let's go back to NATO topic. NATO has created a Ukraine-NATO Council. In your opinion, could this council be helpful to change situation in Ukraine?
Well, I hope it facilitates discussion. It was intended to get rid of the MAP program. That's the substitute for it. And I think that having this mechanism, particularly having in mind the 75th anniversary summit in Washington next year, Biden could be in the middle of a re-election campaign. This ought to be a profound incentive to get it right, as opposed to the way it came out in Vilnius. So I hope Ukraine takes advantage of it, and that we start out with the common objective of doing everything we can to make it clear to the Russians that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, and to leave no disagreement or discussion at the time of the summit next year.
Let's cover also G7 commitment to provide Ukraine with security guarantees. Could G7 nation provide Ukraine with something more than only guarantee to supply weapons to our army?
Well, I think that's possible. I mean, look, there have been discussions on this issue ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. My own personal view is the only real security guarantee for Ukraine is NATO membership. That's why I wasn't in the Bush administration in 2008 when he supported Ukraine's request. NATO should have made that decision then, and we might be in very different territory now. But I think the fact of NATO membership being the only effective security guarantee is proven by the decision of Finland and Sweden to abandon 75 years of neutrality and seek NATO membership. I think they understood exactly the implications of Russia's two-stage invasion of Ukraine, and they made the correct decision. NATO made the correct decision. I just wish we had made the correct decision on Ukraine and Georgia in 2008.
Let's move with Russia's suspension of the grain deal. Russia suspends grain deal. In your opinion, what is the reason of such decision? Is Putin just rising stakes to remove Western sanctions?
Well, I think the Russian military situation, notwithstanding the situation in the spring offensive, the Russian military situation in Ukraine is grave. And I think what Putin is trying to do is basically shift to a more political battlefield, suspending the grain agreement, the recent attacks on the granaries in Odessa, attacks on Kyiv and other civilian locations are designed to try and weaken Ukrainian morale and convince Europeans and Americans that the war's gone on long enough and we need to move to a ceasefire. I think Putin believes that if the spring offensive can be blunted, if Ukrainian territorial gains can be minimized, then he can take the diplomatic initiative and say, this war's gone on long enough, let's have a ceasefire, and he'll try and win diplomatically or politically what the Russians can't win militarily. I think we have to guard against that. If he tries something like that, or if a European country proposes it, we shouldn't reject it until we see clearer, more decisive results from the ongoing military activity.
In your opinion, how should the US react to Russia's suspension of the grain deal? Do you support NATO ships escorting grain shipments from Ukraine through the Black Sea?
I do support that. We should have done it from the beginning. If everybody was agreed that the grain shipments are going to proceed, who can object to providing security against mines at sea that have gotten loose or anything else? I mean, this goes back to the earliest days of the war. I don't see why NATO couldn't have provided a protection, a no-fly zone in Western Ukraine, might have saved some civilian casualties. It's just another example of this timidity, this fear on the part of the White House and European countries that if we do something like that, that constitutes escalation and we'll be in World War III. The Russians have used this to their advantage time and time again, and we have missed opportunities that cumulatively by now might have affected the state of the war.
I have also some question about US internal politics. Former US President Donald Trump has said that if he were a president of the United States, he would end the war in Ukraine in one day. Do you believe in it? And does he even understand what is going on in Ukraine?
No, he doesn't understand what's going on in Ukraine. And I very much worry what would happen if he did become president again. And certainly why I and many other Republicans are trying whatever we can to make sure he doesn't get the Republican nomination for president.
What is the possibility that criminal cases against Donald Trump could influence his possibility to run for a presidency?
Well, that is a possibility. I think the main event that needs to happen is an actual jury trial on one or more of these indictments, and the jury finding him guilty. That, I think, would be like an earthquake in the presidential campaign. The indictments alone, however, do not appear to have had much of a political impact. So I do think we need to see at least one trial and conviction.
Could he be jailed before the presidential election? Is it real for Donald Trump to be behind the bars?
Well, unlikely. If he is convicted in one of these cases, he will certainly appeal. And I think he would seek to remain out of prison until the appeal is heard. And I think courts would likely give him that.
And my last question for you will be regarding the support of Ukraine from the US citizens. Do you feel that there is still a high level of support to provide Ukraine with security guarantees from the American nation and from the US Congress?
Yes, I think support remains very high. I think the dilemma is that many people, including myself, don't feel that the Biden administration is pursuing a coherent strategy. So do we support Ukraine? Absolutely. Do we support what Biden has been doing? No, because it's not achieving the objectives that Ukraine seeks and that are really in America's best interest as well. So it sounds like a complicated position, but support for Ukraine as such, I think, remains very strong.
Are there any chances that Biden administration will change their strategy and provide Ukraine with more weapons?
Well, I certainly hope so. And there's a lot of pressure in Congress from Republicans and Democrats, and has not been successful so far, but I think they're going to keep it up.
Thank you, Ambassador Bolton, for your time and for participation in our interview again, and glory to Ukraine.
Yes, thank you very much, and good luck.